Is there any will to see legal changes towards mental health in Grenada?
Well, Grenada has a Mental Hospitals Act. And that Mental Hospitals Act dates back to 1895, 127 years ago. And that's the act we still operate with today. There were efforts and initiatives that I happen to know about to have a modern Mental Health Act. And that also dates back more than 15 years ago.
I understand that there is one that you follow that is from 1959.
No, the 1959 Act relates to guardianship.
Oh.
In other words, it's a UK Act, if that's the one you're referring to.
Yes, definitely.
Right. Frequently, if someone suffers from a mental illness or has some mental incapacity and is unable to take care of his business, you can have somebody applying to the court as guardian, to be appointed guardian, to be in charge of that patient's business. So we have a Guardianship Act, but that is different, fundamentally different from a Mental Health Act. And I can tell you that the Mental Hospitals Act is not just in urgent need of amendment, but needs to be discarded altogether for a new act. Just to possibly indicate, as you said in your opening, there is this stigma attached to mental health and people with mental health. And what that act does, that 1895 Act does, is to feed into that stigma. In fact, it probably creates the stigma itself. I was pretty surprised when I first interfaced with it, I think back in 2004, when there were some initiatives. I know PAHO was involved to have a new Mental Health Act. And I was approached to do some preliminary work in relation to it and had to look at the Mental Hospitals Act, and I was shocked then to see that the references, to put simply, that the reference or categorization of a mental health patient was lunatic. It speaks of an act to deal with lunatics, and the concept of lunatic runs through the entire act. And that is to tell you, that was 1895, and we still operate with the act today, 127 years later. So the law itself does not do anything to bring people away from that kind of concept of mental patients.
What derailed that first attempt in 2004 to update it? What derailed that? Because you say you were approached to do some preliminary work on it. What derailed that?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I could answer it myself. I've made several inquiries, and probably you are in as good as, or probably even a better position than me, because I can tell you that the approach was through PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, and the initiative was really to get a new Mental Health Act for Grenada. And I remember coming up with a draft actually, that was based on the Jamaica legislation. And subsequently that was submitted. I didn't hear anything about it again until several years later, sometime in 2010, when I was approached now to do consultations throughout the country, throughout the length and breadth of the country, on this proposed Mental Health Act. That was about 2010. So what happened is that PAHO looked at the initial draft, and of course they would have sent it to their own technical experts, and they would have upgraded it. And that final draft was used for consultations. And I remember going throughout the length and breadth of Grenada, Carriacou and Petit Martinique also. Or we held one session in Carriacou, both Carriacou and Petit Martinique. I can't remember. I tend to mix it up with constitutional reform sometimes in terms of the consultations. But I remember going to St. David's. I remember distinctly the St. Victoria consultation, Sauters, Grenville, throughout all the parishes. And then I also recall, because I remember traveling, and that was in about 2010, 2011. And there was a deadline for the report. And so I recall distinctly because I remember completing the report while I was outside. In fact, working through the night to ensure that I met the deadline. And that was more than 10 years ago.
Since then, have you heard anything?
Well, not haven't heard, because I've made inquiries and I know it is there. The report is there sitting somewhere. But the act itself, there is no, I have not heard, anything. I know about promises to try to bring it into effect. But of course, if you are to treat with mental patients seriously, you need the legislation to support it.
Definitely.
You cannot be operating with these, even as I say, the language is outdated. You don't no longer refer to crazy people and mad people and lunatics. That's really long ago outdated. Mm-hmm. And so there is something there. I know there is a draft sitting somewhere. There's a report relating to nationwide consultations sitting somewhere, but it's a matter of getting that draft off somebody's desk and bringing it to finality. So I know PAHO would have been involved in it. It was not just a local initiative. But that's the position. And the focus of new mental health legislation would be focus on the protection of patients, the rights of patients. Mm-hmm. In fact, what we have now, as I discovered then, reality hit me during that exercise, is that you had basically people being deposited literally in the mental hospital, and it was like a home for persons who suffered from mental illness. So, for example, it was quite an eye-opener to realize that there were people in the mental hospital 35 and 40 years. Could you imagine that somebody is going to the general hospital because he or she is sick, and then even a year later still being there, or 2 years later, much less 35 years later being there? It speaks to the outlook with regard to mental patients that still exist up to today.
What do you recall what was in the draft? Can you share anything that you made any new?
But one of the fundamental shifts from the old was the focus on community mental health care. Okay. In other words, no longer keeping mental patients as prisoners in hospitals, depositing a mental patient and leaving him there, him or her forgotten for years. There was actually a procedure with timelines, a procedure that involved specialists to more than one doctor, up to 3 doctors, that will assess whether or not that patient ought to be released. And it was not left for even for the discretion of an individual as far as time, because there were time limits imposed by the Act.
Okay.
So, for example, what if you needed to be kept in the hospital, then it had to be for good medical reason. A doctor was required to check you after the 14-day periods, 21-day periods, 1 month periods. And then, so the aim is you go there to get well. And then you are released and the community health care program takes over. And there was a requirement, for example, to create a database of mentally ill persons. And so that database, they'll be monitored and show whether people had to take medication. So at the community level, it involved home visits or at the regular health centers. But the focus was to create institutions that would look after people with mental health. So you don't wait until somebody starts to behave in some extreme way, and then you call in the police and somebody ends up either dead or seriously injured.
With the police, so you brought up the police. What provisions were made in what you remember to aid the involvement of the police or not? Because many a times they are called in and they are given bad press because of how things are handled. And, it's, if I may say, it's not their job per se, but it might come to a criminal point where the person might have a weapon and they have to protect themselves. I'm not saying it's a year on this situation, but what provisions were made for the involvement of the police?
Right. I, again, distinctly remember that was a major issue during the consultations. The consultations at the community level, the issue of the police. And I must say the police, they were involved in the consultations in all the parishes. And I recall distinctly one of the issues with the police. Well, first and foremost, they are not trained to deal with these situations. So what does a police officer confronted with a person who is behaving violently? What that police officer is trained to do is to basically bring the situation under control, and to bring it under control most times meant taking down the person. And it would be either taking down the person, killing the person, or seriously injuring the person. So you had many of these instances and stories where mental health patients were actually shot. Some shot and killed, some shot and badly wounded. And in relation to the police now, and many times the police come under criticisms for all kinds of things. The police themselves, they operate with limited resources. So I remember, again, one of the complaints, they have limited transport. Now, this is a health issue. It just falls under the category of mental health. The police are not trained to deal with mental health, but they are the ones called because some measure of force is required. So one, they have to use the limited transport that they have, to which, again, people complain about. They call the police and the police take long to come, but they have limited transport. And then they have to take, just imagine something happens in Satés, and then you have to go take that patient down to the hospital in St. George's. And most times, especially if there is an injury, you go to the general hospital in the emergency department. Mm-hmm. And one of the complaints, I remember distinctly of the police, is there sometimes you have to wait hours with the patient. hours before they can be seen. So valuable, apart from the transport, first of all, they're not trained to deal with it, save in a way that exhibits force to bring the patient under control. But they are left with no choice to deal with it because there are no other, or there's no other institution in society to deal with it. Secondly, they have to use up their scarce resources to deal with it. And of course, in terms of transport. And thirdly, they have to spend valuable time. And a lot of it is just wasted time waiting for the mental health patient to be given attention. So, so that was and I suppose still is the existing model. The proposal was to have a special mental health team. And I believe
they have the special victims unit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think Jamaica has it. Trinidad has it. I believe I'm subject to correction, but I know either they once they once had it and possibly still have it. But the recommendation was to have this special team. And the team would include nurses, like trained people, who can go there and first of all seek to bring the situation under control. And I remember distinctly too, as I'm talking to you now, some of it is coming back, but the use, for example, of taser guns. So for example, you may go, somebody might be really violent and you have to bring them under control. It's not, a live bullet is not the first option. And if the police officers who go there cannot physically themselves bring that person under control, they need to have facilities. And one of that was a taser, like taser guns. So a taser gun would not kill you, but it would disable you sufficiently to bring you under control. And then the folks take over. You know, whatever medication you need to get to calm you down, but a life is not lost. So that again was one of the recommendations. So it really that new legislation spoke to, among other things, the human rights of patients, because it was recognized that patients too are frequently exploited, like people take over their property, people take over, their belongings, and, families discard them because they feel, listen, I can't control them. There's a place called Monge, and you can go and live there. So Monge is not really a hospital, it's more like a home for mental patients. And so I had the direct experience of actually interfacing with people. They 30 plus years, imagine people in a hospital, 30 plus years. So, those are the kinds of issues I remember coming out of the consultations and being included in the new legislation.
If there is a situation where, would you consider this? If there's a situation where a patient, a family cannot handle that family member who has a mental illness. So I'm thinking there should be another institution as a whole, not Monge per se, which is a hospital, for patients like that, instead of lumping everybody together. For the 30 odd years, someone is in the hospital, as opposed to being in a home where they would get specialized care. Precisely. But what you need is a mind shift with regard to mental patients, because all these are possible, and it's possible to implement them. But you need first of all the vision to again understand that just as people suffer from physical illness, mental illness is also an illness that
can be managed just like any other illness. So what society has been, in a sense, taught, they have grown up to laugh at people. But it happens less now because people are, getting more and more conscious. But, people have mental problems. You tease them, you make fun of them, and they don't get the treatment that is required. So they then become marginalized and eventually a forgotten group in society. So you need that mind shift, and you need legislative intervention to make sure that the law supports any policy, any new policy that seeks to see mental health patients as people too, just like any other citizen.
You spoke about being called upon to help write a new legislation. Have you represented anyone, any mentally ill person who would have caused grievous harm or even murder?
Yes, I have.
How is that handled with the 1895 law?
Well, the 1895 law deals mainly with hospitalization. The hospitalization of patients. The criminal code deals with criminal offenses, so like murder. And only recently, in fact, within the last month, I had to point out to the court in an appeal involving someone who was not master of his mind at the time a gruesome crime was committed, that even the criminal code speaks to lunatics, and the treatment of not a mental patient, not somebody suffering from a mental illness, but again, 2022, with as lunatics. So I have had in the past and up to recently, because there was a matter brought before the Court of Appeal in relation to sentencing, and you may recall that issue where two heads were severed in St. Andrews several years ago, back in 2010, actually, and the heads brought to the
police station.
Now, again, just, of course, very gruesome. The police officers themselves couldn't handle it. One female officer, understandably at the front desk, fainted.
See, that's trauma for the police as well. So how are they?
Everybody, right?
Yeah.
Everybody. But the mere, just how the whole incident played out, then you know that person is suffering from some mental defects at the material time. Now, the strange thing about that killing is that this gentleman was seen as close to a model citizen. No, it's not somebody giving trouble. And in fact, at the sentencing, his sentencing, we got all these affidavits from people in the community, and I was surprised. I was quite surprised how he was lauded in the community. And something happened that day. Because of the nature of the incident, and what happened, because normally if somebody commits a crime, the first instinct and his murder is to run away from the scene. That's the first normal reaction. You run as far away from the police as possible. And
he brings the evidence to the police.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now here you have somebody who brings the evidence to the police station and drops it on the counter and declares that I just killed 2 men there. Declares that. And even in the afternoon, is very puzzled as to why he's being kept in the station. Because as he indicated to the police, And he indicated to the psychiatrist the next day that he had to go meet his mother on the airport. So he can't understand why they are keeping him in the station.
Wow.
Now, the killing, and then there was no motive, clear motive for the killing, because these folks were drinking earlier. One was his friend, one was an acquaintance. But now, so I represented him at the High Court. But then came the big issue, which is another issue calling for legislative reform. Because in our law, for murder, there's the option, one, you plead guilty of murder, or you plead not guilty of murder and there's a trial, or the prosecution may accept a lesser plea of manslaughter. And manslaughter involves, again, killing without an intent to kill. Somebody dies, but there was no intention to kill that person. So that's manslaughter. Murder would be killing with an intent to kill. So in this gentleman's case now, clearly, and we brought in, apart from the psychiatrist he saw here at the mental health Monge institution the day after, we brought in a psychiatrist from the United Kingdom, one of the leading psychiatrists there, and also several months later, a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, to do an assessment because this was such a strange killing. No motive on the face of it, and the behavior, even without mental health experts intervening, shows clearly that something is wrong somewhere. Mm-hmm. And but at the point now of the trial, as to how to handle it, there's no doubt that he killed the person. He declared that he killed the people. He dropped the evidence in the station. But obviously, he's suffering from a mental problem. And that now was the challenge. In our law, your options are guilty of murder or not guilty of murder. In some other jurisdictions, not all, but several jurisdictions, there is what you call diminished responsibility. Okay. So St. Lucia, for example, not too far away, in their law, there is diminished responsibility. And what diminished responsibility means is, yes, I killed the person, but at the material time, the
mental faculties
just, I was suffering from a defect of the mind, which all the doctors confirmed. All the doctors confirmed. And then we went on to, there was no option because we don't have diminished responsibility. So the hope now is that in the sentencing, that it be treated, the mental aspect be taken into account.
Wow.
And so there were about 4 medical reports that supported that at the material time, he suffered from a defect of reasoning to the extent that he was not master of his mind and could not have appreciated right from wrong, as the first psychiatrist who checked him the day after, because he was insisting that he did nothing wrong, even at that time, up to 24 hours later.
Wow.
So he pleads guilty to murder, of course, because diminished responsibility is not available. And then the judge proceeded to sentence him to 35 years in prison, and and to spend 25 of those years before any review is done. So there was an appeal done again and now in the sentencing, he received high marks in all the critical departments, right? One, he received an excellent, what you call, social inquiry report. And that's independent, the state going to the community, speaking, everybody had good things to say about him. Then the possibility of rehabilitation, great. The remorse and everything, of course, when he came to, and he himself can't explain what happened. Now, he does not usually suffer from a mental problem, and therefore, and even subsequently, so he's okay now. He's okay now. And the issue even of people who, as I say, are up and about, but, you know, they have mental issues because mental sickness or mental illness is a form of illness. Yeah. So the appeal essentially was based on the fact that he was treated as a regular, normal person who killed another one. Mm. And the facts, even in the face of the evidence, that the court did not take that into account. So he was more or less, the focus was on punishment. Mm. Right? The focus was on punishment. Listen, this was a gruesome crime, and therefore you are being punished for the crime. Now, so that was the basis of the appeal. But of course, the big sticking point was he pleaded guilty to murder. And therefore, the judge treated it as someone who pleaded guilty to murder. And though the judge took into account the mental aspect of it, but it was murder as opposed to a situation in St. Lucia, for example, where if we had diminished responsibility as an option in our law, then that sentence would have been significantly less. Okay. Because the focus then was, so diminished responsibility is akin to manslaughter. Yeah. Diminished responsibility reduces it to manslaughter. So here he is, because there's always, in criminal offenses, there are two elements that must be satisfied. One is called the actus reus, which is the act itself, what was done. The killing, chopping, shooting, whatever. And then the mental element, or the mens rea, which is the intent to do what was done. We are saying, and it's accepted, that if you are suffering from a mental illness, you cannot form the necessary intent. If you don't know what you are doing, you can't form the necessary intent. So it's really a unique case, a very unique case. But again, it brought to the fore
the need for amendment.
That issue as to how the law treats with people who suffer from mental illness.
Wow. This is interesting. What I'm getting from you is that there's a need for for them to take into consideration that amendments need to be made. A room has to be made for people with mental illness in the event of. And so there's need for that. So what happens now? You said that you did the work and everything is on somebody's desk. How do we wake this up? How do we get them to pay attention to it? How do we wake this up and get something done?
Well, waking up is, requires some activism and, just making it a priority. And that's what lobbying is all about. I suppose there isn't the institutions in society, apart from the established state institutions, to do the kind of independent lobbying that is required.
When you say independent lobbying, what needs to be done? If somebody wanted to pick it up.
In other words, somebody needs to look at the legislation. They may wish to make further amendments, because this is 10 years, 11 years now. But you must have, you cannot, and this is the main point, you cannot have in 2022, 127 years after an act is passed, a Mental Hospitals Act, without any change or significant change, referring to mental patients or people with mental illness basically as lunatics. And in a sense, emphasizing the old view of society that society takes of mental patients. You can't have that existing as the law today. There has to be something fundamentally wrong. And therefore, the legislation must change.
Yeah.
Whether or not in terms of the latest 2010 draft or otherwise, it must change to fall in line with the modern thinking, and especially rights-oriented for mental health patients, with the fundamental underlying theme being people with mental illness are people too, just like everybody else in society. And that we need to get our laws, our institutions in place so that we can adopt this new approach. Right, so that's what I'm saying. There was work done. Different governments take different policy positions, but I'm sure that nobody would disagree at any level that there is need for new mental health legislation. And as I raised with the DPP recently, because he was on the other side of the that matter I just referred to, and pointing out the criminal code needs to be amended. You can't have a criminal code again just treating, with concepts as lunatics, with total disregard the fact that it is an illness.
Yeah.
And if you don't treat with the illness early, then society will have to treat with it sometime later. And at that point, lives may be lost. So it's really a need, there's really a need for prevention, there's need for management, and the new trend is at a community level. So just as somebody suffers from diabetes or whatever condition, somebody gets injured and they go to a mental health clinic in the community, that mental health clinic, not mental health, but a health clinic in the community, that health clinic should be equipped to also deal with mental patients, but not just that. In this age of technology, where you don't have to write everything in a notebook, you can build databases, with people who suffer from mental issues. So anytime there's a sign, and society is conscious enough that, listen, this is a sign that something is coming on, you are able to handle it immediately. So you take a community approach to the problem, not one that just waits until somebody starts off with little depression or whatever, then that develops, eventually explodes, somebody dies, everybody blames everybody, and then you have a legal system, a criminal justice system that condemns that person as a normal person and treats that person as a normal person, and that individual then gets sent away. Who wins in such a situation? You have to create a system that gets society involved in it. So if you're dealing with it at a community level and somebody in the community and neighbor sees, well, listen, that person not too right today. They may have not taken their medication or whatever. You can make a call. Somebody can visit a home. You know, that's where things are going. So society has to be concerned about people. And the people society has to be concerned about is not just what we call normal people, but all its people. All its people, whether suffering from mental health issues or some physical issue that needs treatment and attention from professionals.
Does Grenada have a mental health act?
In a manner of speaking, why do I mean that? Or what do I mean by that? We follow the Mental Health Act of 1959 out of the United Kingdom. There's a reason for that, but it will take a while to explain. Let's just leave it at that. That is what we follow. It is certainly far from ideal, because what that means is that we don't have our own legislation. There are certain instances where under our legislation we refer to laws coming out of the United Kingdom. This is one such instance. Another instance, by way of example, would be matrimonial proceedings. We don't have our own matrimonial law in Grenada. And so we follow the law from time to time coming out of the United Kingdom. Just as a point of reference, you may find it interesting, in the United Kingdom, so far as I'm aware, their Mental Health Act has been revised up to 2021. So they are themselves following legislation which has been updated up to the year 2021. But for particular reasons, we are still following the 1959 Mental Health Act out of the United Kingdom. That has implications for how dated that legislation is. That has implications for how relevant, contextually, that legislation is for our needs in Grenada and our resources in Grenada. Law always has to be seen in context. When law is passed, it is passed in the context of the jurisdiction. So that, for instance, I expect that the Mental Health Act in the United Kingdom 2021 reflects a certain contextual situation, including taking into account what the mental health challenges are that are being addressed in that legislation, what the system, the available system is to address the mental health issues that arise, and so on. So going back to our local situation, I think there is consensus in the fraternity that we need to have our own localized, so to speak, mental health legislation. What we find is that many of the applications that are made in the High Court relevant to that or connected to that piece of legislation, the Mental Health Act of 1959, they tend to be applications having to do with people who want to assume control of the affairs of those who, because of mental health challenges, and typically I think tending to be where someone has reached a certain age and is experiencing diminished capacity due to age or the onset of age-related diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia, and the like. Many of the applications in the High Court in Grenada touching and concerning the Mental Health Act have to do with that factual circumstance. So, and there are procedural challenges because the Act really doesn't fit squarely with what the needs are and the changes that obviously have happened since 1959. So we work with that to the extent possible. Such applications are usually supported by medical evidence of two practitioners attesting and affirming the on an evidentiary basis the mental state of the person in respect of which an application may be made, and affirming the need for or the desirability of having someone take charge of that person's affairs for different reasons. But we know that mental health concerns, you can look at it as a spectrum, in the sense that there are so very many health issues and diseases and so on that can run along that spectrum. And there are also some issues where criminal law and mental health collide. And those are not really addressed adequately, if at all, under the legislation that we're following. And that is the reason why, anecdotally, you will see in the community very many examples where the police are called upon to intervene in situations where mental health and the criminal law collide, and there's no easy answer. We've had instances where the police have resorted to using, well, I can't avoid using the word killing, because I think that's really what it amounts to. And there's a hue and cry, because I think it offends the sensibilities, really, that in a situation where someone who is challenged by mental health and is acting in a way that puts others in harm's way, that no real answer can be found to take care of the situation, which may escalate to a point of violence, except to visit violence upon that person who, I mean, there's a category of criminal, the old time word is lunacy, and that alone tells you how dated such a concept is, because that's the term that you see in the legislation such as it is. You'll also find that in, we have a Mental Hospitals Act as well, which in some measure makes provision for some of the issues arising from what that legislation terms as criminal.
Is it outdated?
No, it's outdated. Of course it's outdated. That also is in need of an overhaul. I think really, if we were to look positively ahead to what really is required, I would suggest something along the line of the treatment that was given to the suite of legislation dealing with domestic violence, because that attempts to sort of coalesce all the various elements that need to be put together to really address issues concerning domestic violence. So the psychosocial issues, the need for there to be collaborative treatment of the issue as between the social services sector, the police, and ordinary citizens. Something along that line, I think, is the approach that has to be taken, because there are issues of simple mental health, and there are issues of criminal mental health, meaning someone who is afflicted by a mental disease that may result in a criminal act. And the law considers in certain instances that even though you may have committed a criminal act, because you are affected by a mental disease, you don't have the requisite, in the criminal law we speak of mens rea, meaning the mental capacity, which is an element of making out a crime. Because you are affected by that disease, you are not excused, but the court and the law makes an allowance that someone who is affected or afflicted, so that they don't literally know their own mind, even though in the commission of a criminal act, there is a different treatment that is required for people who are so afflicted. And we are not finding in our judicial system, and perhaps even in our social system, adequacy of law and systems to be able to address that in a comprehensive way. So if we're to look to a fix, I would suggest that any legislation and that is considered has to take on the comprehensive elements. It can't be, so we can't address the issues connected to criminal acts of those who are affected, and also making provision for those who simply need appropriate treatment, whatever the nature of the disease along the spectrum. We can't address it in any piecemeal fashion. It has to be done collaboratively. That is what I think would assist in the approach that is needed. I have had to advise in a family situation, or in more than one instance, where someone affected by disease has engaged in acts which potentially could cause harm to other members of the family. And it's very difficult to know, what is the right avenue, because the police and the way that the policing system works in Grenada is not really equipped to deal with that. So that has to involve a collaboration between police, between the medical personnel who would have to advise and be involved. We don't even really have proper facilities, because in other parts of the world distinctions are drawn between those who require treatment for certain mental health diseases and challenges, and there tends to be a segregation, so that those who are criminally insane, if that is the right, I'm not even sure if that's the right language, because I know that over time we've come away from these pejorative types of labels, but for want of a better expression, those who suffer from diseases that could potentially lead to criminal acts and harm to others, they are given separate treatment, both in terms of the facilities and how the law is, we know that there are instances where there are people in the regular prisons who really belong in another kind of facility. We know that even the facility which we do have, which is the one we're familiar with at Mount A, there really should be some allowance for a level of segregation, so that all of the people don't end up within the same system in the same facility, because the problems require separate and distinct treatment. So there's a lot to be done. Fixing the law is one thing, but equally important, even if we finally turn our attention to updating the laws and localizing a mental health act for our purposes and addressing our contextual circumstance, we also have to equally make sure that the supporting systems are there for the police, for social services, for the medical system, for the health system, so that all these things can work together to give the necessary support for those who unfortunately find themselves in that situation. And it can be anybody. We have this way of stigmatizing in Grenada. We very uncharitably still refer to the mental health hospital as a madhouse, and that tells you a lot about how far we have to go in Grenada. But this is a problem. It, like any other disease, it cuts across all classes, it cuts across all sectors of society. In the same way that diabetes does that, or that any of the other chronic diseases, that's the approach we should, I think, in our mindset, consider that this can happen to any family in Grenada, and it's a problem for all of us. It's not something where we can just isolate people and put them away from us and not have to consider it. It can happen to any family, and we need to be sensitive to that, be sensitive to the treatment that we give to these people, because it could be any one of us.